The NIV says, I would not be comforted. So sometimes our human nature, we just want to air our grievances. We just want somebody to hear them, but we don't even care what they have to say. We're not looking for feedback. We're not looking for comfort. Quite frankly, sometimes we just don't want to be comforted. And so that's the mood that Asaph's in when he's writing this. He says, I reached out to God, and I did not want to be comforted. And he goes into airing his grievances. For me with kids help put in perspective our relationship with God as our kids grow up and we kind of interact with them. When my kids get upset about something, specifically if it's at me, they're going to make sure their grievances are known to me. They're going to air all their grievances out, and it doesn't matter if I try to explain to them why this happened or if I try to comfort them. They don't want to hear it. Not at all. Just the other day, we were talking to Evan. He came in. Lindsay and I were talking, and he came in. I don't even know what he was mad about, but he comes in asking what we're talking about, and we're still kind of talking, and I answer him, and he's sitting there saying, What? I said, I just answered you. He's like, What? No, you didn't. What? I said, I literally just answered you. I told you what we're talking about. And so that's kind of the idea that's going on here with Asaph. He's coming before God. He's airing his grievances to God. And he's saying, I'm not even listening, God. I want to get my grievances out. I want to fuss about it. I can't be comforted right now. And so that's kind of the point that he's at when he starts this psalm. So at least he's self-aware and he's admitting what he's doing. He says, when he remembered God, he is disturbed. So he even goes as far to say, I think about God and I'm disturbed. Or in another translation, it says, I remembered you, O God, and I groaned. It's something that we probably wouldn't dare say right now if we were to think about it while we're talking to somebody else about God. I thought about God and it made me mad. That's what he's saying. He's saying, I'm frustrated with God. And he's owning up to that at the beginning of this psalm. I think we can relate to that, although we might not want to admit it. Right. Yeah. And he's in the middle of a time of trouble too. That's the other thing. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, verse 4. You have held my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. And so he's admitting here that his heart is hard. He's saying, I'm so upset I can't even speak. But God held my eyelids open. He held my eyes open. This translation says eyelids. It really is. He opened my eyes, similar to what we see when Paul writes to the church at Ephesus in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 18, saying, open the eyes of their heart. That's what he's talking about here. God opened his eyes so that he wouldn't completely turn away from God. Even though his heart's hardened, he recognizes it. And that's what he's coming to God for, is to say, God, my heart's hardened, and he's wanting to do something about it. And make sure the reader understands how upset he is. He's so troubled that he can't even speak. Typically we think about that in relationships with our lives. I don't know that we do that with God, but surely some of us kind of get there at some point. Then he goes in and he tells us what his complaints are. So he starts listing out his complaints in verses 5 through 9. I have considered the days of old, the years of long ago. I will remember my song in the night. I will meditate with my heart, and my spirit ponders. Will the Lord reject forever? And will he never be favorable again? Has his loving kindness ceased forever? Has his promise come to an end forever? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Or has he, in anger, withdrawn his compassion? Selah. And so he airs out what he's thinking about. He's sitting down and he's meditating and he's thinking about years long, long ago. So he's reflecting back on his life. He's reflecting back on the history of the Israelites. And he's thinking about, and what he'll go into in a minute, he's thinking about all big things that God did for them. And he's looking at all those big things and kind of reflecting back on it and thinking, pondering, meditating, is God still on my side? Has he turned his back on me? Has he turned his back on the Israelites? Will he not give us those big, huge victories or those big, huge blessings that he gave us long, long ago? Has he broken his covenant with the Israelites, or have we broken our covenant with him so that it's no longer valid, that he no longer wants to bless us? Does he even love us anymore? Has he forgotten to be gracious? Is he mad at us? So Asaph's airing his heart out, trying to figure out the way that he's perceiving a reaction from God. He's perceiving it as if God's not there. He perceives it as if God doesn't care. Again, going back to kind of our kids as an example, Evan does this when he's mad. He's not interested in any logic or reason or anything I have to say when he's fussing at me about something that he thinks is unfair or something that didn't go his way. He just kind of bang, 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 bang. He lists it out. Here's what I don't like. You don't do this. You do this for Brooke. You do this for Emma. You don't do this for me. And just list it all out. And he doesn't care what we have to say. And that's what Asaph's saying here. To me, it reminds me of like a honeymoon period. So if you think about the relationship, or even that term that we talk about, a honeymoon period, Israel went through some really difficult times, and David at the helm was considered righteous by God, and so God blessed Israel in battle and many other ways, in big ways. And that's what he's looking back on years ago, when God did all these big things for the Israelites that were big and visible, and everybody knew that God blessed them because they got through this battle with the Philistines, or whatever it was that he's looking back on. So he's looking back on those things and he's thinking, why isn't God doing that for us now? What is it that we've done? What's different between then and now? Just like the honeymoon period we look back on in a relationship, you look back on early in the relationship when your partner was doing all these little things for you, or these big grand gestures that they may no longer do. And here we are 20, 30, 40 years later, we might look back on that and think, they still love me anymore? Because they're not doing those things that they did when we first met, when we were courting each other. And if they're not doing those big things for me, maybe it means that they don't love me anymore. And that's the same concept that Asaph has here. Instead of remembering all the little things that God's doing for him, just like in a marriage, all the little things you do for each other day in and day out to show your love for your spouse may not be the big grand gestures that you once did when you were trying to court them. But you do those little things day in and day out. So just like that, God still blessed the Israelites. It's just not the big grand gestures that Asaph is looking back on and thinking about from years ago. So I think we can relate to that. I think a lot of us are the same way. I would think most of us have something that we've had in our past where we can clearly say, I know God did that. I know God got us through that, and he blessed me in this big way. And if we look back on it and we think about that and we think, well, I hadn't had anything like that in a few years. You know, is God still really care? Does he really still care about me? I think we can have those same thoughts that Asaph's talking about here. One of the things that Asaph probably isn't thinking about is these blessings that he's talking about, that God gave them, are a result of, most of them, hard times. So he forgets about the hard times that they had to go through and the battles that they had to go through with the Philistine and the Amalekites and whoever else they were battling for God to bring them to victory. In the middle of the battle, it wasn't fun. The problem is he's right now in the middle of whatever battle it is that he's facing, spiritually, physically, emotionally, whatever it is. He's in the middle of the battle and he just thinks, God's not with me. He doesn't care. So he looks back at, he did that back then. Why doesn't he do that now? And it reminds me, we're in the middle of basketball season. I just refereed a game yesterday. And then when you're refereeing a game, everybody in the stands wants to fuss about, you called this down there, but you didn't call it down here. Well, in a basketball game, every single play is different. It might be similar circumstances, but it's not the exact same thing. And so, you're not going to call something that isn't relevant to the play if it's not a big deal, right? It's just going to be different depending on what the situation is. who has the ball, what's going on in the game. So it's the same thing with our lives. God's not going to react the same way in every situation in our lives, just like we think he should, just like he did last time. We're not going to be blessed exactly the same throughout our life. So when we get in a time of trouble, if it's not resolved quickly, because we're humans, because we're impatient, we like to think that if it's not resolved quickly, is God even listening? Does he even care? We start questioning God. We're so focused on the here and the now that it clouds our judgment of, we kind of step back and look at, where are we in the grand scheme of things? I think about the events of a few weeks ago, the airplane that crashed in D.C. tragically. We look at that, and half the country is now probably terrified to get on an airplane. But if you kind of step back from that and you think, before 2025, there were a total of 100 people killed on a commercial commercial flight in the U.S. But because this is on the national news, people already have this fear of flying. Everybody kind of is in a panic that, oh no, there was this airplane crash. And it's a terrible thing, and we hope it doesn't happen again, but it's hard for us, with our human nature and our fears, to step back and look at the big picture. If we compare it to automobile deaths, over the last 20 years, there have been 100 people killed in an airplane crash. There have been 750,000 or more people killed in a car wreck. And none of us thought twice about hopping in the car and driving to church. It's just our human nature to focus on the things that are in front of us and not be able to step back and kind of look at the big picture. So along that same line with the air fly, there's more than 45,000 flights per day in the U.S. And yet we focus on this one flight that happened one time in 16 years. So our lives are the same way. It's the same thing with human nature. We get in trouble, we get into the middle of something, we're in the middle of sin, something bad's going on in our life, and we get so focused on that thing that we think, I'm here alone. That's the only thing going on in the world. God doesn't care about me. And we just can't kind of step back and look at the big picture. And so we continue with this psalm. I think it gives us a good kind of thing to look at and to do as we get into that situation in our lives. I think I skipped ahead. Let's read the last 10 verses, starting in verse 10. Then I said, it is my grief that the right hand of God, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. I shall remember the deeds of the Lord. Surely I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God of works. You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your strength among the peoples. You have by your power redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph, Selah. The waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you. They were in anguish. The deeps also trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth a sound. Your arrows flashed here and there. The sound of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was in the sea, and your paths in the mighty waters, and your footprints may not be known. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and of Aaron. So as he's sitting here airing his grievances, he does take time to pause and recognize, and he kind of comes back and says, my grief is, I think God has changed. I think God's different. And so what he starts to do is go back and list the things that God's done for him before. And so as Jocelyn mentioned earlier, it may not be here in the psalm where we see the resolution. I think it's interesting. We don't have really a resolution to this in the psalm. But we can look at how he went about it. Rather than just airing his grievances and just letting it go and saying, I don't want to hear from you, God, he did think back on the things that God had done in his life. So I think we can take heed of that when we're going through difficult times. We cry out to God. We may not get instant resolution. Just because he cried out to God, God didn't fix it right then. He might have given him peace. He might have given him comfort at some point along while he was writing this psalm. But it still is going to take time for whatever situation it is to be fixed. And it's the same for us. Whatever situation we're going through, we can bring it to God, and it's okay to be angry with God and question God. That's why it's written for us in the Word. That's why we have an example to see. That's what His people have done in the past. But we need to also look at the example of how they reacted. We need to use that in our lives and look back on what are the good things that God have done for us. And kind of try to step back, just like with the airplane example. Rather than getting focused on the situation that we're in, step back and think about all the things that God's done for us in our life. And if He's really gotten us to this point, is He really going to let us go through this trial and fail, and it's going to be the end of the world? Probably not. So I think it's just a good example for us as we look at how we reflect on difficult times in our life. Right. Yeah. Right. That is the end of the chapter. Is there any more conversation or discussion? Yeah, that's a really good point. Even Christ, as God, in His human form, had the same questioning attitude. Did you have something? Yeah, definitely. That's kind of how I first read it too. Was he sitting up late at night writing this? And that may be the case. That it was something that he was up late at night pondering, and typically when we do that, things are always worse late at night. Right. Any other thoughts on this chapter before we close? Right. Another thing I didn't say is that one of the other important things that he did was he vocalized it. He didn't internalize it. He didn't hold it in. I think I struggle with that personally. It's just holding it in and just getting through to the next day. And sometimes that works, but a lot of times it doesn't. And so he vocalized it. He got it down on paper. He wrote it out. And I guarantee you, he felt a lot better after he got this psalm down on paper. And probably the Israelites, as they listened to it being sung, as they learned it and sang along, it brought them peace and comfort as well, because they're going through similar times in their life. So a lot of times just vocalizing it instead of keeping it bottled in helps. Yeah. That, right. And that's where that Selah, I think, is so interesting that we keep talking about it, where all the breaks in there. And it's almost like they stepped away and they thought about it and they came back and it's like, okay, now I've taken a breath and I can be more rational and I can finish out my thoughts. Any other thoughts before we close? Mike, would you care to close in prayer?